Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Let's start with the copyright disclaimer. Welcome to part 5 of Cut Into the Murder of Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia. In this episode, we're going to talk about her funeral, and then we're going to lead into the first suspect. As you may know, Beth Short's mother, Phoebe, first learned of her murdered daughter when a Los Angeles newspaper reporter telephoned her and lied to her about Beth winning a beauty contest in order to gain information about Beth's past. And then after they got the information, he told her mother what really happened to her daughter. Phoebe Short, along with two of Beth's sisters, flew from Medford, Massachusetts to Berkeley in order to get together with the sister that was living there and her husband and prepare for the funeral. They were inundated with photographers at the railroad station bound for Los Angeles to claim the body of their sister, their family member. Here you can see how very similar Beth did look to her mother, who is pictured in the middle here. Allegedly, the Los Angeles Examiner paid for Beth's mother to fly to Los Angeles. Shit, at this point, it was the least that they could do. Beth's father, Cleo, the winner that he was, hadn't seen his daughter in 4 years since she was basically booted out of his Vallejo home, and he wanted to, quote, keep out of this whole thing. Good old dad. He didn't attend her funeral, and he even refused to identify her body, and he basically remained drunk and uncooperative. Here you have her mother, her sister Dorothea, sister Eleanor, and sister Muriel. They arrived from Boston, Massachusetts. Now note for later that Betty's sister Virginia hadn't heard from her in at least 2 years. Virginia was the one that lived in Berkeley. And also, when allegedly Beth tells Red Manley that she was waiting for her sister, one wonders if Beth might have just been telling him a fib. On January 25th, 1947, Elizabeth Short was buried on a hillside in Oakland Hills Mountain Lawn Cemetery. Only her relatives were present, along with police officers, at the burial, which had 8 flower arrangements. The Reverend G. Raymond White, pastor of the First United Presbyterian Church in Oakland, intoned these words from the well-known hymn, Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly. There also was an inquest before the body was buried, going over the cause of death and the manner of death and trying to pin down the last time she was seen. And when the mother was asked a question about when she was first notified when her daughter died, Miss Short jumped up and blurted, she was murdered. She half rose from her chair. She wasn't going to play with this, your daughter passed or your daughter died. She knew her daughter had been murdered. Here's a picture taken from the inquest of one of Beth's sisters. Beth's mother's on the right, and Red Manley, the first suspect. The hunt for her killer initially centered around her boyfriends and acquaintances, of which there were many. The investigators looked to determine where Beth had been and what she'd been doing the week before her body was discovered. The investigation was hampered by the publicity, the actual publication of the location of the body, the details of her death, the last known place she was seen, all these little details. However, there is still one last key question, which has been held back, never released, and never properly answered. The police spoke with her friends, some of which we've already mentioned, Lynn Martin, Marjorie Graham. People were literally walking into the police department and confessing to this awful murder. The Black Dahlia murder made national headlines for weeks and brought out every crazy that you could imagine who felt like confessing. So, who and what was seen around the lot at Norton before the body was found? One person saw a thin man, approximately 45 years old, who was seen lurking around and then sped away in a 1935 model light cream sedan. Another person saw a dark car, like a Studebaker or something. The police were also on the lookout for a torture den, a private space where Beth was tortured, like a remote building, a shack with running water or a private residence. So the police made house-to-house inquiries in the Leimert Park area, focusing between the 39th and Western areas. I'm also including in various suspects the information culled from the Freedom of Information Act, because the FBI was helpful as they were able to aid the local police department in the hunt for the killer. Even Hoover seemed more than willing to offer help however and whenever available and answer the letters mailed directly to him, even from random people who suggested tips on how to catch the murderer, gave hunches, or gave possible suspects. So let's talk about the first suspect, Red Manley. We've already mentioned him. He's the red-headed salesman that had met Beth when he picked her up. And he was also the last person to see her at the Biltmore. He dropped her off at the Biltmore. She said she was waiting for her sister, and her sister never arrived, and he had someplace to go, so he left her there, and she was allegedly seen in the lobby for quite a while afterwards. And he allegedly had an alibi. Just want to note that a year or so after the murder, and he was cleared, he became a mental patient at Patton State Hospital, and the doctors told police that Red rambled about having committed a murder. So Detective Hansen, went to Patton State to see Red again, and he watched while the man was given sodium pentothal. That's truth serum. And he was questioned again about Miss Short, but he knew actually nothing about the murder. He had also, through the course of the investigation, been given 2 lie detector tests. You can even see the pictures of him strapped up when he was first initially being held and questioned and then let go. His wife, oh, did we mention he was married? Yeah. His wife, was in the lobby ready to kiss his cheeks and hug him and make a big photo op of Stand By Your Man. But then a year later, he's going off to the mental hospital. I mean, Manley had several mental breakdowns in the following years. Oh, by the way, he also said the only reason that he picked up Beth was that he was, quote, making a little test to see if I was still in love with my wife. Like, oh my gosh, seriously? I think I said before, I hope she smacked him after these photos. And I'm including some of the FBI's communications back and forth regarding Red Manley. They were trying to be helpful to the LAPD and also just kind of letting them know that they had some information that maybe Manley had some mental issues to look into. And some regarding Manley, he always denied killing Beth. He said, it wasn't me, I wasn't there. He was initially booked as a suspect. He was questioned by Harry Hansen and the rest of the detectives. He passed a polygraph test, and then he was released. That's where you saw those pictures of the kissy face with his wife. But the suspicion did remain, and they found out he had an earlier history of mental problems, and those mental problems continued. And in 1954, his wife had him committed to a mental hospital because he said he was hearing voices. And then when he was there, he said something about killing people, or he had killed somebody. He was mumbling some stuff. So that's when the detectives came back. They administered sodium pentothal, and he was again cleared. In 1986, Red Manley died alone in an Anaheim apartment, 39 years to the day after he left Betty at the Biltmore. And the authorities said that his death was the result of an accidental fall. Another man who was a suspect for a short period of time was her old boyfriend, Joseph Gordon Fickling. He was an airline pilot in Charlotte, North Carolina at the time of her death. He dated her, but then he was stationed overseas, kind of similar to her relationship with Matt Gordon. And he kind of became more of a friend than a boyfriend, and he did give Betty a money order in December of 1946, but he was kind of giving her the brush off, you know what I mean, in a way. He wasn't seemingly going to marry her, and then she told him not to write her anymore at San Diego, that she was going to Chicago. And he thought her intent was to travel to Chicago with some guy named Jack, but he was released from the Army mid-November of 1946. He went to work in Charlotte, and he had an alibi. So even though people looked up, around about him and looked into his record, and you see that he was a suspect. He totally had an alibi. The entire week that Beth was missing and or murdered, Joseph Gordon Fickling was in North Carolina working. Just like Red Manley, after he dropped off Elizabeth at the Biltmore, I believe he went to work, and he also did go home to his wife. So both men had pretty solid alibis. So when you're looking at these suspects, keep this in mind. This was not a quick murder. This wasn't a drive-by shooting. This wasn't a one bullet and run. This was something that took a little time. Someone hit her in the head at least 3 times with a blunt force object, probably rendered her unconscious for a minute or two, and then tied her up, because you don't tie up someone who is conscious. So they tied her up, and she resisted the restraints as shown by the body. And then they performed some sharp force injuries around her mouth. So what led to her death was the concussion of the head and the shock with the sharp force injuries. So that took a little bit of time in itself, and that's not figuring in any of the other torture. All right. So then let's say that was all there was. You still have the bisection of the body, and then all the cleaning, and then all the cleanup and the moving of the body. So this took a little bit of time. Men and women both were literally jumping out of the woodwork to confess to this horrible crime. Daniel Voorhees, age 33, he was a white male, a war veteran, working as a Los Angeles busboy or restaurant porter, and he phoned the police and said, "I killed the Black Dahlia," but he refused to give any further details. The police were skeptical of his confession because he didn't know anything. And also, for example, Voorhees also claimed that he met Beth Short in 1941. However, she wasn't even in Los Angeles until 1943. He knew nothing about her. He knew nothing about the crime. He also gave no specific details to lend any kind of credence to his story. Regardless, the FBI did give more information to the LAPD about Daniel Voorhees because he had previous charges for 1934 auto theft, 1936 disturbing the peace, rape in 1942, a vagrancy charge in September of 1945. And though this individual was not a stellar individual, he was not the killer, and they were able to rule him out as just a publicity seeker wanting his 15 minutes of fame. People underestimate how much time and resources that the false confessions take up. Another person that falsely confessed was a guy named Joseph A. Dumais. Corporal Joseph Dumais signed a 50-page confession in longhand that he, quote, felt sure he killed Beth, but his mind, quote, blanked out while drinking, and he said he had a date with Elizabeth Short on January 9th or the 10th, 5 days before her body was found. And he said that he'd had a 4-year relationship with Beth. The Army was holding him as a suspect under charge of suspicion of her murder. But the Fort Dix records that were thoroughly culled and searched over time had the corporal at the installation, Fort Dix, on the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th, with a lapse of 4 days until the 17th. On February 6, 1947, the police requested the criminal record of Corporal Joseph Dumais from the FBI. The weak part in the case against Dumais was that the Fort Dix record showed that Dumais was at Fort Dix at 3 in the afternoon on the 15th. So Dumais could not have dumped the body in the early morning hours and returned to the base in time. I do believe they thought that he really did know Beth. So that's the rub with this one. But she knew a lot of enlisted men, make no mistake. But 5 enlisted men swore that Dumais could not have done this crime, as he wasn't even on the West Coast during this time period. He was at Fort Dix. I found so much information on the wacky false confessions, even those from the ladies. But rather than drag down the series with the false confessions, in the next part, I'm going to only deal with the viable suspects. We're going to look at Jeff Connors / Leslie Dillon, that's tied in with Mark Hansen, allegedly. We're going to look at Dr. George Hodel. We're going to look at Dr. Walter Alonzo Bailey, and we are going to look at Dr. Patrick O'Reilly. I just want to add that I don't have a favorite pet suspect. So there's a few people that I have bad gut feelings about, but I think all of the cases and all the suspects have points that look suspicious and things that can't be explained, and then by that same token, reasons that it doesn't make sense. And we'll get into that in the next part. And I want to say thank you so much for watching, and thanks so much for subscribing. I appreciate the subscribers. It helps me to reach 1,000. And without further ado, have an excellent day. Bye.